There is a kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. I know that now. I didn't know it at 63 when I thought I understood what exhaustion meant. Back then, tired meant a long shift at the plant, or a bad night on a lumpy mattress at a fishing camp north of Sudbury. Tired meant something you slept off by Sunday morning, and then you were fine again by the time the hockey game came on. This was different. This was the kind of tired that settles into your chest somewhere around February and doesn't leave when the snow melts. It just changes shape. My wife, Helen, had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's 18 months before any of this happened. She was 61 years old. I was 64. We had been married 37 years, and I had never once imagined standing in a neurologist's office on Berry Street in Kingston while a woman in a white coat explained to me very calmly and very gently that my wife's brain was slowly forgetting how to be a brain. That the woman who remembered every birthday in our extended family, who could quote entire scenes from movies we'd watched together in the 1980s, who still corrected my grammar when I got lazy with it, that woman was going to need help. Increasing help. The kind of help I didn't fully understand yet. I kept nodding in the office. I kept saying I understand, thank you, yes, we'll make an appointment with the specialist. And then I walked Helen out to the truck in the parking lot on a cold Tuesday in November. And I held her hand across the center console, the whole drive home on the 401, and I didn't say a single word the entire way, because I didn't trust my voice to stay level. She looked out the window at the fields going by. She said, "The birches are pretty this time of year." And they were. They really were. The first year was manageable, if that's even the right word. Helen had good days and harder days. She repeated herself sometimes. She lost track of conversations. She'd leave the kettle on and then forget she'd turned it on. Small things. Things you could explain away or laugh about gently if you were determined to find the light in it. Our daughter, Renata, called every Sunday. Our son-in-law, Calvin, would drive the 3 hours from Ottawa on long weekends to help with the yard or fix whatever needed fixing around the house. Calvin was a quiet man, steady. He'd been with Renata for 11 years, married for 7, and I had always respected the way he moved through the world. Careful, deliberate, not given to showing off. He worked in logistics. He was the kind of person who thought before he spoke, which in my experience is rarer than it sounds. Our son, Mitchell, lived closer. 40 minutes outside Kingston, in the same area where he'd grown up, which I'd always taken as a sign that he was rooted, that he valued family. He worked in insurance. He had a good job, or so I understood it to be. He had a girlfriend named Stacy who I liked well enough, though she never quite seemed at ease at our dinner table. I told myself that was shyness. It was Mitchell who first suggested he take a more active role in managing things. It was a Sunday in early spring. We'd had supper together, the 4 of us. Renata and Calvin had driven up. Helen had made her chicken and leek soup from the recipe she'd been making since before Renata was born, and she'd had a good day. One of the clear days, where she was entirely herself, sharp and funny, and asking Calvin about his brother's new baby, in Kannada, with all the right questions. After supper, Mitchell helped me clear the table while Renata sat with Helen on the back porch. He rinsed dishes. He didn't look at me right away when he started talking. He said he'd been thinking. He said he was worried. He said the thing he'd been building toward was this: what happened if something happened to me? Helen was already requiring more support. If I had a health event, a heart thing, a fall, anything. What was the plan? He said he'd been reading about it. He had a folder. He'd actually brought a folder, which he pulled from his jacket and set on the counter. Printed pages about power of attorney in Ontario, about financial planning for couples navigating cognitive decline, about what happened to assets when a caregiver became incapacitated. I looked at the folder. I looked at my son. He was 41 years old, and he had the same jawline his grandfather had, square and certain. He said, "I can take this on, Dad. The bills, the accounts, the insurance. You're already carrying too much. Let me carry some of it." I said I would think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I talked to Helen about it on a good morning over coffee, before the fog came in. She said, "Mitchell loves us. That's enough for me." She said it the way she said things back then, simply and without suspicion, and I took it as a kind of answer. I signed the power of attorney documents. Mitchell had them prepared. He said he'd used a paralegal he knew through work, that it was all standard, that we just needed to get them notarized and we'd be set. He drove them to a notary in Kingston. He handled all of it. He said it was easier if he took care of the logistics, that I had enough on my plate. I thought, this is what good sons do. The arrangement felt natural at first. Mitchell started handling the monthly bills, the hydro, the internet, the property tax installments, the home insurance renewal. He had access to the joint checking account and to the savings account I'd been putting money into since I was 26 years old, the one I'd started when I was working at the paper mill in Espanola before we moved south. He said he'd flag everything, that I'd see all the statements, that nothing would happen without me knowing. And for the first few months, that seemed to be true. Helen's condition moved through its seasons. Spring was hard. She had a stretch of 3 weeks where she didn't sleep well, and the disorientation was worse at night, which meant I didn't sleep well either. She'd wake up at 2 in the morning and not know where she was, and I'd talk to her quietly in the dark, the same way you talk to a frightened child, not condescending, just gentle. Just here, you're home, I'm right here. By summer she'd stabilized somewhat. We drove up to Sharbat Lake for a weekend, because she'd always loved it there, the way the light hit the water in the late afternoon, and we sat on the dock and didn't need to say very much. I was not paying close attention to the money. I understood that about myself later. I had spent 31 years working at a manufacturing company outside Kingston. I'd started on the floor and retired as a shift supervisor, and I had been careful my whole life. Not rich, but careful. We had the house. We had Helen's small pension from the school board, where she'd worked as an educational assistant for 22 years. We had my RRSP, which had grown slowly and sensibly over 3 decades. Not dramatic numbers, but enough. Enough to manage what was coming. But I was tired in that deep way I described. And Mitchell was handling it. And I trusted him because he was my son, and because I could not see a reason not to. I should tell you what I noticed, in hindsight, and why I didn't register it at the time. There were moments. Mitchell called one Thursday in October to tell me the home insurance had gone up, that he'd shopped around, but this was the best rate. I nodded on the phone. He mentioned the hot water heater was due for inspection, that there was a fee, that he'd taken care of it. I said thank you. There was a property matter, something about our neighbor's fence encroaching on the property line, a surveyor's report that Mitchell said cost more than expected. I said fine, these things happen. Each thing on its own was unremarkable. Each thing felt like the ordinary friction of maintaining a life. It was Calvin who first noticed something. He had come up alone in late October, a Thursday, because Renata had a work thing she couldn't miss. He helped me re-caulk the windows before the cold came in, and afterward we sat at the kitchen table with tea, and he was quiet for a while in the way he sometimes went quiet when he was working something out. He asked me carefully how things were going. Not Helen things, money things. I told him Mitchell was handling it. He nodded. He didn't push. He went back to Ottawa on Friday afternoon, and I didn't think much more about it. Then came the Sunday in November. Renata and Calvin had driven up again. Helen had had a rough week. She'd had a fall, nothing serious. Her hand on the kitchen floor, a bruise on her palm, and Renata wanted to be there. We had supper, a roast chicken this time, and Helen was quieter than usual, but she was present. She held Renata's hand across the table. After supper, Mitchell came by. He hadn't been expected, but he showed up around 7:30 with a bottle of wine and a story about being in the area. He sat in the living room with us for an hour. He was charming. He was funny. He had a way of filling a room, my son, always had, ever since he was a teenager. He could make you feel like the most important person in his world when he turned his attention on you. He left around 9. We said goodnight. I was in the kitchen washing the wine glasses when my phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Calvin. I picked it up. It said, "Don't react. Come out to the front porch. Leave your phone on the counter." I stood very still for a moment. Then I set the phone face down on the counter and walked through the living room, where Renata was reading on the couch with Helen, said I was going to get some air, and stepped outside. Calvin was on the porch in his jacket. The temperature had dropped and his breath came out in small clouds. He spoke quietly and quickly. He said he'd been looking at something he probably shouldn't have been looking at, but he needed to tell me. He said he'd seen a bank statement on the kitchen counter 3 weeks ago, the visit when he'd come up alone, and a number had caught his eye. A withdrawal number. A big one. He hadn't said anything then, because he didn't want to be wrong. He'd spent 3 weeks thinking about whether he was reading it correctly. He said, "I think you need to look at your accounts tonight, before Mitchell gets too far from here. I think something is wrong." My hands were cold. I wasn't wearing a jacket. I asked him how much. He said he wasn't certain. He said the number he'd seen on that one statement just 1 month was around $14,000, He said Mitchell's name was the one on the transaction. I went back inside. I walked to the bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed where Helen was already asleep, her breathing slow and even, and I opened the banking app on my phone. I had never paid much attention to it because Mitchell had access, and I trusted that he was watching it for both of us. I looked at the checking account first, then the savings account. Then I opened the RRSP statements through the brokerage portal, the one I hadn't logged into in 6 months, because Mitchell said he was monitoring it, and I didn't need to worry. My RRSP had had just under $320,000 in it 18 months ago. I had looked at the statement before I signed the power of attorney because I wanted to know the number. I remembered the number. I had always known the number. What I was looking at now was $91,400. I sat on that edge of the bed for a long time. Helen slept. I could hear voices from the living room, Renata's low and familiar. I thought about the fence survey. I thought about the insurance adjustment. I thought about the hot water heater. I thought about 100 small things, each of which I had accepted without blinking. And I understood, with a kind of cold clarity that doesn't feel like anything in particular. It just arrives and settles, that my son had been taking money out of my retirement for a year and a half. Not all at once. Not in any way that would have been obvious if you weren't looking carefully. In pieces. The way you'd do it if you understood how not to trigger a flag at the bank. The way you'd do it if you'd thought about it. I walked back out to the porch. Calvin was still there. I told him the number. He didn't say anything for a moment. He put his hand on my shoulder. He said, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner. I told him not to be. I told him it wasn't his fault. We went inside and we told Renata. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface in front of her, the way you brace yourself against something. She asked 3 questions in a row. Are you sure? Does Mom know? What do you want to do? I told her I was sure. I told her Helen was asleep and I didn't want to wake her. I told her I didn't know yet what I was going to do, but that I needed to know what I had actually signed first. That was the thing that Calvin had been trying to tell me, gently, on the porch. He had a background in contracts, logistics work, freight agreements, supplier documents, and when he'd been up in October, he had noticed the power of attorney paperwork on the corner of my desk, the folder Mitchell had left behind. He had flipped through it. He hadn't said anything then, because he wasn't certain he was reading it correctly, and he didn't want to alarm me without cause. What he believed, what he told me that night quietly, at the kitchen table after Renata stopped crying, was that the notarization didn't look right. In Ontario, a notary or commissioner of oaths is supposed to witness the actual signing. They're supposed to see your pen touch the paper. They're supposed to ask questions. The dates on the documents suggested they had been signed before they went to the notary, not in front of one, which meant they might not be legal. Which meant everything Mitchell had done under the authority of those documents was built on a foundation that wasn't what it appeared to be. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen until 4 in the morning with a cup of tea that went cold and a notepad where I wrote down everything I could remember. Every conversation, every phone call, every explanation Mitchell had given me that I had accepted without pushback. The fence, the insurance, the hot water heater. I wrote it all down in the order it had happened, as best I could reconstruct it, and by the time the sky started going gray over the backyard, I had 3 pages of notes and a kind of stillness in my chest that I recognized as the thing that comes after grief. When grief has done its initial work and what's left is just the next step. I called a lawyer on Monday morning. Not a friend, not someone I knew socially, a lawyer I found through the Law Society of Ontario's referral service, a woman who specialized in elder law and estate disputes, with an office on Princess Street in Kingston. Her name was Elaine Forsyth. She was brisk and clear, and she did not make me feel foolish for not having caught it sooner. She reviewed the documents within 48 hours. She called me on Wednesday afternoon and told me what Calvin had suspected was correct. The power of attorney had not been properly executed. The notary who had signed it, a man whose office was in a strip mall outside the city, had not witnessed the actual signing. Miss Forsyth was careful with her language. She said the document appeared to have been brought to him already signed. She said that in her professional opinion, this constituted a defective POA, which meant it was potentially void. She said this was both bad news and good news, depending on how you looked at it. She also said I should contact the Kingston Police Service and make a report. I did that the same afternoon. I drove to the station on Patrick Street, the city police, not the OPP, and I sat across a desk from a financial crimes officer named Sergeant Whitmore, a woman about Baudar's age with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and I told her everything. I brought the notepad. I brought the bank statements I'd printed at home. I brought the copy of the POA documents that Miss Forsyth had returned to me with her annotations. Sergeant Whitmore took notes. She asked careful questions. She explained the process, that it would take time, that these investigations always took time, that I should not contact my son or alert him in any way that I was aware of what had happened. She said that was important. I drove home in the November dark on the 401, and I sat in the driveway for a while before I went inside. I had to tell Helen. I had been putting that off since Sunday night. She was having a good stretch, a few clear days in a row, and I had been telling myself I was waiting for the right moment. But there is no right moment for something like this. I went inside, and I made her a cup of chamomile tea, and I sat across from her at the kitchen table, and I told her, plainly, directly. Because she deserved that. She listened without interrupting. Her hands were wrapped around her mug. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, I want you to know that I don't blame you. I told her she had nothing to blame me for. She said, I know. I'm telling you that so you don't spend the next 5 years blaming yourself. She knew me that well, even then. The investigation took 7 months. There were periods of silence when I heard nothing from Sergeant Whitmore or from Miss Forsyth, and I had to trust that things were moving even when they didn't feel like they were moving. During those months, I did what I had to do. I worked with Miss Forsyth to establish a proper power of attorney, legal, witnessed, executed correctly, naming Renata as my first point of contact and Calvin as backup. I worked with my bank, TD in Kingston, to review every transaction Mitchell had made over the previous 18 months. The total was $217,000. Gone through a combination of direct transfers to accounts in his name, cash withdrawals that I had been told were for household repairs, and one large transfer, $62,000, that had moved to an account I didn't recognize, and that the police were still tracing. Mitchell had also taken $4,000 from Helen's personal account, the one connected to her school board pension deposits. He had done it in 5 separate withdrawals over 6 months. 700 here, 800 there. The way you'd do it if you were counting on nobody to notice. I will tell you something about the period after I found out, before the investigation resolved. People ask what it feels like to know your child did something like this, and I don't know that I have language precise enough for it. It's not simply anger, though anger is there. It's not simply grief, though that is there too, and it had been there already because of Helen, and this new grief had to share space with the other one, which made everything heavier. It's more like a rearrangement, like discovering that the floor plan of a house you've lived in your whole life is not what you thought it was. A room that you believed went somewhere leads somewhere else entirely. I kept thinking about him as a boy. He'd played hockey, defense, not flashy, but reliable. He'd driven Helen to the hospital in the middle of the night once when I was working nights, and she'd had a bad fever, and he'd been 17 years old and he'd handled it without waking me. Had sat in the emergency waiting room at Kingston General for 2 hours, and only called me once she'd been seen. I had been so proud of him for that. I had told people about it. This was the same person. I don't know how to hold both things at the same time, even now. I expect I never will. The charges were laid in the following June. Mitchell was charged under the Criminal Code of Canada with fraud over $5,000. Section 380, which can carry up to 14 years, though the sentencing in these cases rarely reaches that ceiling. He was also charged with breach of trust and with fraudulent use of a power of attorney. His lawyer argued that the POA had been valid, that Mitchell had been acting in good faith, that the transfers had been intended to manage expenses on my behalf. Sergeant Whitmore and Miss Forsyth had anticipated this argument. The evidence of the improperly notarized document, combined with the transaction records, was not consistent with good faith management. It was consistent with systematic theft. He pleaded guilty in September to 1 count of fraud over $5,000. The other charges were stayed as part of the plea. He received a conditional sentence, 2 years less a day, served in the community, with strict conditions including no contact with me or Helen, mandatory repayment, and community service hours. He also received a restitution order for $143,000, which was the amount the court determined could realistically be recovered, given his financial situation. The remainder, nearly $80,000, the investigators were not able to fully account for. I sat in the courtroom on the day of sentencing, and I watched the back of my son's head, and I did not feel what I expected to feel. I expected relief or some version of it. What I felt was just the weight of it, the fact of it, that this had happened, that it was real and not a misunderstanding, and not something that would resolve into a different story if I looked at it from a different angle long enough. Renata held my hand through the whole proceeding. Calvin sat to my right with his arms crossed and his jaw set, the way he went when he was holding something back. We went to the Sleepless Goat on Princess Street afterward, the three of us, and we had coffee and sandwiches, and nobody said very much. And that was fine. That was exactly right. Actually, the silence between people who have been through something together and don't need to name it out loud to know what it is. Helen was at home with a care worker we'd brought in 3 mornings a week, a woman from a home care agency in Kingston, who was warm and patient and who Helen had taken to immediately. We had reorganized the finances. We had adjusted the budget around the reality of what was left in the RRSP. Not what I'd planned for, not what I'd worked 31 years toward, but workable, with the pension income and the supplements, with some careful thinking about the house. Miss Forsyth had connected us with a financial advisor who specialized in retirement planning for families managing long-term health care needs. We were not where I had expected to be at 64, but we were not without ground to stand on. I drove home from downtown Kingston on a September afternoon, with the trees just beginning to turn, the maples going orange along Division Street, and I thought about the birches on that Tuesday in November 2 years ago. Helen looking out the window, saying they were pretty. She still had good days. Not as many as before, and the good days were quieter, less words and more presence, but they were still there. On the good days we sat on the back porch with tea, and sometimes she held my hand, and sometimes she just rested her head slightly against my shoulder, which she had always done since the early years of our marriage, a small habit that had never changed. I thought about what Calvin had done. He had looked at a number on a piece of paper and carried it alone for 3 weeks, turning it over, not wanting to be wrong, not wanting to tear something apart that didn't need tearing. And then he had stood on a cold porch in November and told me the truth, because he understood that the truth was more important than comfort. That's not a small thing. That is not, in my experience, a common thing. Renata called me every Sunday, the same as always. Sometimes we talked for an hour. Sometimes it was 15 minutes. Always, before she hung up, she asked about her mother. Not in a clinical way, not how is she progressing, or any new symptoms. She just asked, "How's Mom today? What did she have for breakfast? Did she sleep?" The small questions that mean I'm still here, that you're not carrying this alone. I go for a walk most mornings now, early, before the day fills up, down to the waterfront and back, along the Cataraqui, which is quiet at 6:30 in the morning in a way that Kingston doesn't often get. There's a heron that I see sometimes at the same spot below the railway bridge, standing in the shallows without moving, and I have started to look for it on the mornings when I need something to focus on outside myself. I don't have a simple conclusion for you. I don't know that this kind of thing ends cleanly. What I know is this. I trusted the wrong person, and the right person, a quiet man who drove 3 hours on long weekends and recaulked windows and paid attention when I wasn't paying attention to myself, is the reason we got through it. I also know that if you are carrying something like this, an account you haven't looked at in months, a signature you don't quite remember giving, a phone call from a family member that didn't quite add up, it is worth looking. It is worth the 5 minutes and the discomfort and the possibility that you might be wrong. It is almost always worth looking.